My name is Elena Whitmore. I was 26 years old when everything I believed about family unraveled before the sun had even risen on Christmas morning. The cold cut straight through the thin sweater I'd fallen asleep in. Snow rested quietly on the porch railing, and my suitcase waited beside the front door. I reached for the handle, but my father pulled it back inside without saying a single word. Across from him, my mother folded her arms, her face unsettlingly calm, as if she'd practiced this moment in her mind long before it happened. "You'll come crawling back," she said with a small, dismissive laugh. "You can't survive without us." Then the door closed. Not with a furious slam, just a quiet, deliberate click, as though they were shutting out a cold breeze instead of their own daughter. I stood there for what felt like forever, unable to move. Christmas lights shimmered across the neighboring houses while faint laughter drifted through the icy morning air. Somewhere nearby, children were tearing open presents. Somewhere else, families were gathering around warm tables, filling their homes with the familiar sounds of the holiday. I had nowhere to go. At first, I refused to believe what had happened. There had to be an explanation. Maybe they just needed time. Maybe they expected an apology for something I didn't even realize I'd done. More than once, I unlocked my phone and started typing a message. But every draft ended with the same question. For what? No answer ever came. As I made my way toward the bus stop, each step felt strangely detached, as if my body had gone on without waiting for my mind to catch up. Memories surfaced one after another. The holidays where I quietly cooked dinner while my younger brother opened presents first, the birthdays that somehow celebrated everyone except me, and the constant lesson I'd been taught that gratitude meant never asking uncomfortable questions. For years, I'd convinced myself that was simply what family looked like. Now those memories followed behind me like silent witnesses, each one exposing a truth I'd spent years trying not to see. Hours later, sitting alone on a nearly empty bus, a forgotten memory suddenly returned. My grandfather. A week before he passed away, while the rest of the family argued over hospital paperwork in the hallway, he quietly slipped a small envelope into my hand. "Keep this somewhere safe," he whispered. "And don't tell anyone about it until you truly need it." Inside was an old bank card. I had never used it. To be honest, I'd always assumed it held a few $100s, just enough to help if I ever found myself in an emergency he feared might come. As the bus rolled through the quiet streets toward downtown, I pulled the worn card from my wallet. Years of being carried around unnoticed had left the plastic scratched and its edges smooth with age. For reasons I couldn't explain, my racing heartbeat finally began to settle. It was the one thing my grandfather had ever asked me to protect. And for the first time since my parents had closed that door behind me, I found myself wondering if he'd seen this day coming long before I ever did. The bank was nearly empty, wrapped in the quiet stillness that settles over Christmas morning. A beautifully decorated tree stood near the entrance, its white lights shimmering across the polished floor. Under different circumstances, it might have felt warm and inviting. That day, it only made me feel like I was standing outside someone else's happiness, looking in. I walked to the counter with the old bank card resting in my hand. "I'd just like to check the balance," I said softly, almost embarrassed by the request. The teller offered a polite smile and slid the card into her computer. At first, everything seemed routine. Then her expression changed. The smile disappeared, replaced by a puzzled frown. She stared at the screen for several seconds before glancing up at me. Without offering an explanation, she quietly excused herself and disappeared into the back office. I waited, convinced there had to be a mistake. Maybe the account had been closed years ago. Maybe the card had expired. Maybe the system simply couldn't read something that old. I prepared myself for disappointment before anyone had even spoken a word. Whatever happened next, I told myself I'd find another way. I had no other choice. A moment later, a man in a dark suit stepped out of one of the offices. His name badge identified him as the branch manager. He looked down at the card, then back at me with an expression that was difficult to read. It wasn't suspicion. It wasn't excitement. It looked more like someone trying to make sense of something they hadn't expected to see. "Miss," he said gently, lowering his voice, Would you mind coming with me? There's something I'd like to show you. A knot tightened in my stomach as I followed him into a private office. He closed the door quietly behind us and gestured toward a chair. Before turning his computer monitor in my direction, he paused and asked a question that caught me completely off guard. Can you tell me how you came into possession of this account? It belonged to my grandfather, I replied. A few days before he passed away, he gave me the card. He told me to keep it safe and not tell anyone unless I truly needed it. I never used it. Honestly, I always assumed it held a small emergency fund. The manager nodded slowly, studying my face as if he were confirming something that had only just begun to make sense. Without another word, he entered several security credentials and waited for the system to finish loading. Then he turned the monitor toward me. The screen filled with rows of numbers. At first, they meant nothing. My eyes drifted across the page until they landed on the account balance. I blinked, then leaned in closer. Surely I'd misread it. Surely I'd counted the commas wrong. The manager didn't interrupt the silence. He simply watched as the truth settled over me, giving me time to absorb what I was seeing. My hands began to tremble, not because of the money, because, in that single moment, it felt as though the foundation beneath everything I'd believed about my family had quietly given way. Whatever my grandfather had left me, it was never just an inheritance. It was the beginning of a truth that someone had spent years making sure I would never discover. The manager let the silence settle between us. He seemed to understand that some truths couldn't be rushed, that they needed a moment to sink in before anyone tried to explain them. I know this is a lot to take in, he said gently. But before we talk about the account itself, there's something else I think you should see. He opened a secure file connected to the account. My grandfather's name appeared at the top of the screen, followed by a scanned document that had been uploaded years ago. Beneath it was a handwritten letter. The moment I saw the familiar looping handwriting, my chest tightened. I didn't have to read a single word to know it was his. Then my eyes found the opening line. My dearest Elena, if you're reading this, then life has unfolded exactly as I feared it would. My vision blurred almost instantly. I gripped the edge of the desk, and for a brief moment, I wasn't sitting in a bank office anymore. I was back in my grandfather's workshop, breathing in the scent of cedar as he carefully repaired old clocks. He used to tell me that time revealed a person's character far more honestly than words ever could. I never truly understood what he meant. Until now. I force myself to keep reading. You have spent much of your life being taught to make yourself smaller, so others could feel bigger. I watched it happen more times than I care to remember. Whenever I tried to step in, I was told I worried too much. Maybe I did. But I also knew your heart. And I knew there might come a day when you would need proof that at least one person saw you exactly as you were. A quiet ache spread through my chest. For years, I had questioned my own memories. Every achievement that went unnoticed. Every sacrifice that was quietly expected. Every family gathering where my opinions faded into the background while everyone else's mattered. I had spent so long convincing myself I was simply being too sensitive because accepting the alternative hurt far more. Now, without ever saying it aloud, my grandfather had confirmed what I'd never been able to admit to myself. I wasn't imagining any of it. The manager quietly slid a box of tissues across the desk. He didn't interrupt or offer empty words of comfort. Somehow, he seemed to understand that this moment wasn't about money. It was about finally being believed. As I continued reading, another paragraph caught my eye. The money is only one part of what I've left you. The true inheritance is the collection of documents secured with this account. They tell the story of decisions that shaped this family for many years. Read them only when you are ready. The truth has weight, and no one should be asked to carry it before they have the strength to do so. I slowly lifted my eyes from the screen and looked at the manager. My voice was barely more than a whisper. What kind of documents? He folded his hands together before answering, choosing his words with obvious care. They may explain why your grandfather was determined that only you and no one else would ever be allowed to open this account. For the first time since I'd been turned away from my parents' house that Christmas morning, I realized the greatest shock wasn't the number sitting in that bank account. It was the family history hidden behind it. And somehow, I knew that once I uncovered the truth, nothing in my life would ever look the same again. The manager unlocked another secure file before reaching into a cabinet beside his desk. A weathered leather folder rested inside. He carried it over carefully and placed it in front of me. Its edges were softened with age, as though it had been opened countless times before finally being sealed away. Tucked beneath the leather strap was a small handwritten note. I recognized the handwriting instantly. Read slowly. Don't let anger read before your heart does. I closed my eyes for a moment, took a steadying breath, and opened the folder. Inside was far more than a collection of financial records. There were letters, copies of legal documents, and a journal my grandfather had kept during the last decade of his life. As I turned the first few pages, I realized they weren't focused on money at all. They were observations, quiet, thoughtful reflections about our family. He had written about birthdays, holiday dinners, graduations, and countless ordinary afternoons. Moments I remembered, but somehow he had seen them very differently than I had. One journal entry made me stop. Elena offered to give up her university trip so the family could afford her brother's sports program. She smiled when she agreed. After everyone left the room, she cried alone in the garden. No one noticed. I remembered that afternoon with painful clarity. Back then, I'd convinced myself I was only crying because I was exhausted. That explanation had been easier to live with than admitting how deeply my heart had broken. I turned another page. This time he wrote about Christmas mornings. The photographs always captured smiling faces, wrapped gifts, and a family that looked perfectly happy. But beneath those memories, he noticed something no one else seemed willing to see. She is always thanked after everyone else has already been celebrated. She never complains. My greatest fear is that she has begun to mistake silence for love. A lump rose in my throat. For years, I dismissed those memories as insignificant. Small moments, petty disappointments, the kind of things I believed I should simply get over. Yet my grandfather had seen every one of them, quietly,
carefully.
He hadn't written those words to condemn anyone. He wrote them so the truth wouldn't disappear beneath years of comforting family stories. Near the bottom of the folder rested a sealed envelope. Across the front, in his unmistakable handwriting, were just 5 words.
For the day Elena asks why.
My fingers lingered on the envelope. For a moment, I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. The manager caught my hesitation and gave a small, reassuring nod. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. I carefully broke the seal. Inside was a single handwritten page. Your parents believed they were making you stronger by expecting more from you than they ever expected from your brother. They called it fairness because, over time, they convinced themselves that you could carry the weight. But neglect does not become love simply because it is explained with good intentions. I paused, swallowing hard before reading the final lines. If they ever ask why you chose to walk away, remember this. Protecting your peace is not abandoning your family. Sometimes it is the only way to stop abandoning yourself. I folded the letter with trembling hands and held it against my chest. To my surprise, I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel the urge for revenge. What settled over me instead was something far quieter.
Clarity.
For the first time in years, I stopped wondering what I needed to do to earn my family's acceptance. Instead, a different question began to take shape. If I no longer needed their permission to be enough, what kind of life could I finally build for myself? By the time I stepped out of the bank, the afternoon light had begun to fade into the soft glow of early evening. Snow drifted gently across the sidewalks, blanketing the city in a quiet calm. In the space of a single hour, my entire world had shifted, yet everything around me carried on as if nothing had happened. People hurried by with shopping bags tucked beneath their arms. Children laughed as they pulled sleds through the park. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang, their echoes rolling through the cold air to mark the passing of Christmas Day. I found an empty bench and sat down, pulling my grandfather's letter from my coat pocket once more. This time, I wasn't searching for answers. I was trying to understand the man who had believed in me long before I ever learned to believe in myself. As I reread the final pages, One passage held my attention. Don't measure your worth by the comfort of people who never learned how to truly see you. Real belonging never asks you to disappear. I read those words several times before quietly folding the letter and slipping it back into the envelope. They stayed with me long after the paper was out of sight. That evening, instead of settling for the cheapest motel I could find, I rented a small furnished apartment for a month. It wasn't luxurious. The furniture was simple, the kitchen was tiny, and the walls showed the wear of many years. But it was warm. The windows overlooked a quiet street lined with old maple trees dusted with snow, and when I unlocked the front door, a strange realization settled over me. For the first time in my life, I was walking into a place that belonged entirely to me. The silence inside felt unfamiliar. Not empty, not lonely, peaceful. Over the next few days, the branch manager arranged a meeting with my grandfather's attorney. As we reviewed the documents together, everything my grandfather had hinted at became clear. He hadn't simply left me money. He had spent years building a carefully structured trust designed to protect me. Every safeguard had been put in place to ensure that no one, not my parents, not any other relative, could influence, access, or claim what he'd intended for me. He wanted you to have choices, the attorney explained. Not because he expected your life to fall apart, but because he worried that one day you'd need the freedom to rebuild it on your own terms. Freedom. The word lingered in my mind long after the meeting ended. For most of my life, I'd mistaken freedom for permission. I had waited for someone else's approval before allowing myself to feel worthy. Now I understood they were never the same thing. 3 days after Christmas, my phone buzzed. My mother's name appeared on the screen. For a moment, I wondered if this was finally the apology I'd been waiting to hear. It wasn't. There was no concern about where I was. No question asking if I was safe. No acknowledgement of what had happened. Just a short message. If you've calmed down, you can come home now. Let's stop being dramatic. I stared at the words for a long time. Only a week earlier, I would have replied immediately, desperate to fix a problem I believed I'd caused. I would have apologized without even knowing what I was apologizing for. This time, I simply turned the phone over and let the silence answer for me. In that quiet moment, I finally understood the lesson my grandfather had been trying to leave me all along. Sometimes, the strongest thing you can do isn't proving your worth to people determined not to see it. Sometimes, true strength is quietly choosing not to return to the place where you first learned to question your own value. As snow continued to fall outside my window, I realized something else. Christmas morning hadn't been the end of my story. It had been the beginning of a chapter my family never imagined I'd have the courage to write. It was 2 days before I answered my mother's message. Not because I wanted to punish her. I simply needed enough distance to separate my own voice from the guilt that had followed me for most of my life. For the first time, I wanted to respond because I had chosen my words, not because I felt obligated to fix someone else's discomfort. When I finally replied, I kept it simple. I'm willing to talk, but only if we're willing to be honest. Several hours later, my father responded. Instead of asking me to come home, he suggested we meet at a quiet cafe. I agreed. Walking back into that house so soon felt impossible. It wasn't just a building anymore. It was a place filled with expectations I was only beginning to free myself from. The cafe was nearly empty when I arrived. Soft winter sunlight streamed through the windows, stretching long shadows across the wooden tables. My parents were already there. My mother looked exhausted in a way I'd never noticed before, as though the past few days had aged her. My father sat silently, turning his coffee cup in slow circles, without ever lifting his eyes to meet mine. For several long moments, none of us spoke. It was my mother who finally broke the silence. "We thought you'd come back by Christmas evening," she said quietly. "You always came back." There was no bitterness in her voice. No accusation. Just a painful honesty. Somehow, those words cut deeper than the laughter I'd heard on the porch the morning they sent me away. "You expected me to believe I had nowhere else to go," I said. Neither of them denied it. My father let out a slow, weary breath, as though he had been carrying those words for years without knowing how to say them. "We convinced ourselves we were making you stronger," he admitted. You handled responsibility so well that every time something needed to be done, we gave it to you. Your brother struggled more, so we protected him instead. Little by little, it stopped feeling like a decision. He looked down at the table. It just became the way our family worked. I listened without interrupting. For once, I wasn't searching for excuses on their behalf. I wasn't preparing a defense. I wasn't trying to make everyone feel better. I simply listened as they described the very pattern I'd spent my entire life living inside. After a long pause, I reached into my bag and carefully placed my grandfather's journal on the table between us. "I've been reading this," I said softly. Neither of them reached for it. My mother didn't even need to open the cover. The moment she recognized it, tears welled in her eyes. "He noticed everything," she whispered. I nodded.
He did.
I let the words settle before continuing. "He wasn't trying to judge you. He just didn't want me to spend the rest of my life believing I had imagined everything." Silence settled over the table once more. But this time it felt different. It wasn't the strange silence of people avoiding the truth. It was the quiet that follows when the truth has finally been spoken, and no one has the strength or the desire to deny it anymore. In that moment, I understood something I had never fully grasped before. Real reconciliation doesn't begin by pretending the past never happened. It begins when everyone is finally willing to stop pretending they experienced it the same way. The weeks that followed were quieter than I'd imagined. There were no dramatic confrontations. No tearful speeches that somehow erased years of unspoken hurt. I slowly realized that healing wasn't the cinematic experience people often hoped for. It came in smaller, quieter moments, in awkward conversations, lingering silences, and the courage to face uncomfortable truths without trying to explain them away. My parents began reading my grandfather's journal one entry at a time. Every few days, my mother would call. "I read another page today," she'd say softly. Then the conversation would end. She never tried to justify the past or defend the choices she'd made. She simply let the words settle. Those brief phone calls carried more honesty than years of forced smiles across holiday dinner tables. One afternoon, my father asked if I'd walk with him through the neighborhood where I'd grown up. The snow had finally melted, leaving the sidewalks damp beneath a pale winter sky. As we wandered familiar streets, we passed the old playground where, years ago, he'd pushed me on the swings until laughter echoed through the park, back before life became so busy that those ordinary moments quietly slipped away. After a long silence, he finally spoke. "I always believed love was measured by sacrifice," he said. "You never complained, so I convinced myself you were okay." I kept my eyes on the path ahead. "I wasn't okay," I answered gently. "I just became very good at pretending I was." He didn't respond right away. Neither of us did. Sometimes silence carries an apology more honestly than words ever can. Over the next month, I began using part of my grandfather's inheritance to build the future he'd always hoped I'd have. I enrolled in graduate school, a dream I'd put on hold years earlier, while everyone else's needs seemed to come first. I moved into a brighter apartment filled with books, thriving plants, and the quiet comfort of choosing things simply because they made me happy. For the first time, my life reflected my own choices instead of my constant effort to keep peace within the family. Eventually, my brother called. His voice sounded hesitant. "I didn't know," he admitted. "I honestly thought Mom and Dad expected the same things from both of us." I was quiet for a moment before answering. "I know," and the surprising part was, I believed him. Children rarely create the patterns they grow up in. More often, they simply learn to live inside them without ever realizing they're there. By the time winter gave way to the first hints of spring, our conversations had changed. We no longer spent our time assigning blame. Instead, we talked about responsibility. Each of us had carried a different piece of the same story, seeing only the part that had shaped our own lives. It wasn't until we began placing those pieces together that the full picture finally came into focus. The same truth my grandfather had quietly protected all those years, waiting for the day we were finally ready to face it. Even so, I knew there was one final step I needed to take before I could truly move forward. I had to return to the place where everything had begun. But this time, I would return on my own terms. Spring arrived so quietly that I barely noticed when winter finally let go. The snow that had blanketed the streets on Christmas morning was gone, replaced by fresh grass, flowering trees, and sunlight that lingered a little longer each evening. One warm afternoon, I found myself standing in front of the same house where, only a few months earlier, I'd been told I would never make it on my own. The porch looked smaller than I remembered. Maybe it hadn't changed at all. Maybe I had. I wasn't there because anyone had asked me to come back. I wasn't chasing closure or hoping for an apology that could somehow erase the past. I had returned for something much simpler, the few boxes of childhood belongings my parents had packed after I left. Before I could knock, the front door opened. My mother stood there, looking at me for a long moment. Neither of us spoke. Then she stepped aside with a gentle smile. "I'm glad you came." There was no pressure in her voice. No expectation. Just quiet sincerity. As I stepped inside, the house felt instantly familiar, yet strangely different. The framed photographs still lined the hallway. My grandfather's old clock continued its steady rhythm, filling the silence with its familiar ticking. Afternoon sunlight spilled across the dining room floor exactly as it had when I was a child. Everything looked the same, but I wasn't the same person who had once believed this house defined her worth. For the first time in my life, I no longer felt responsible for carrying the emotional weight of everyone in the room. We gathered around the kitchen table, cups of tea growing cold as conversation replaced the silence we'd lived with for years. Eventually, my father looked up. "I can't change what happened," he said quietly. "And I can't give you those years back. But I don't want to spend the years we still have pretending they were anything other than what they were." There was no dramatic speech. No desperate promises. Just honesty. Simple. Uncomfortable.
Real.
And somehow, that meant more than any perfect apology ever could. It wasn't the ending I'd imagined. It was something far better. It was the beginning of a relationship built on truth instead of appearances. Before I left, I reached into my bag and placed my grandfather's journal in the center of the table. "It belongs to all of us now," I said. My parents looked at me in silence. "I don't want us to keep reading it, so we can relive our mistakes," I continued. "I want us to read it, so we never repeat them." Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Some promises are made without words. As I carried the last box to my car, the evening sun stretched long golden shadows across the driveway. I paused before getting in and turned back for one final look. The front door was still open. Not because I needed to return, but because, for the first time, no one was standing there ready to close it behind me. People often assume my grandfather's greatest gift was the inheritance he left me. They couldn't be more wrong. The money gave me security. His wisdom gave me freedom. He taught me that self-worth isn't something another person can grant or take away. It begins the moment you stop asking others to decide whether you're worthy of love, respect, or a place where you truly belong. Some people inherit wealth. Others inherit the courage to become themselves. On that Christmas morning, standing alone in the cold, I believed I had lost everything that mattered. Looking back now, I understand that it was the day my real life finally began. And every December, when Christmas returns, I no longer remember the sound of a door quietly closing behind me. I remember the courage it took to keep walking. Because somewhere along that journey, I discovered a truth my grandfather had known all along. Home was never something I had to earn. It was the peace I learned to carry within myself. If Elena's journey resonated with you, let it be a reminder that your worth has never depended on the approval of those who failed to see it. One of the bravest things a person can do isn't proving they're enough. It's realizing they were enough all along. Healing doesn't erase the past, but it gives you the freedom to stop letting the past define your future. If you enjoyed this story, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who may need this message today. We'd also love to hear from you in the comments. What do you think was the single most life-changing moment in Elena's journey, and why? Thank you so much for spending your time with us. Your support means more than you know, and we can't wait to share another unforgettable story with you in the next video.